So I've gathered ADP from a handful of the most popular fantasy platforms to collect basically an industry consensus ADP. The platforms I chose were Sleeper, ESPN, Yahoo, CBS, and NFL.com, so all of the main fantasy redraft sites. And from this industry ADP, I have one player that I'm avoiding from every single round of fantasy drafts. So looking at round one, I said this in my video yesterday, but there honestly isn't a pick I'm completely against here. I think there's a very clear top 8, and then after that, there's a very clear next tier of 3 players. So really, I think the worst pick in the first round is Garrett Wilson at 112, which is not to say that he is a bad pick, just that he is not as good as the other 11 players because they're all just so great. I will say to back up picking Garrett Wilson for this is that you're just banking on his potential upside, but drafting him at wide receiver 7 takes away a lot of the reward for hitting on that upside because you're expecting him to break out and hit at that ADP, which is not entirely a given. Again, I would draft Garrett Wilson as a top 10 fantasy wide receiver. I am not arguing against him. I am just pointing out that he is not a sure thing who's done it already or multiple times even, like all the players being taken around him. I mean, even Puka Nacua put up 1,500 yards and 6 touchdowns last year, which are numbers that Wilson hasn't even sniffed yet in 2 years, and Puka did it in year 1 as a rookie and is being drafted behind Garrett Wilson. And this doesn't even include going running back here with Jahmyr Gibbs or Kyron Williams, who were both top 10 running backs last year. So again, for like the third time, I'm not out on Garrett Wilson, and I don't think that he is a bad pick. I just think that he's at the beginning of a big tier, and I don't really like picking the first player in a tier, especially one who is not guaranteed to even live up to this ADP. Moving to the second round, I will just continue the anti-wide receiver agenda by saying every wide receiver in this range is the worst pick in this round. I just have not found any good reasons to draft any of these guys compared to all of the running backs in this range. Puka Nacua is great, as I just mentioned, but is going a round and a half to 2 rounds ahead of Cooper Kupp, and I just really don't like that difference. Marvin Harrison is arguably the greatest wide receiver prospect that I've ever seen, or at least the best since Calvin Johnson, but drafting him as a top 10 wide receiver as a rookie, again, just takes a lot of the reward out of hitting on his upside. It's the highest that any rookie wide receiver has ever been taken in redraft, and only a handful of rookies have ever finished top 10, and even the ones who did, some were not expected, a la Puka Nacua last year, Justin Jefferson, or Anquan Bolden way back when as the first kind of Puka Nacua, so I'm not really in love with Marvin Harrison Jr. here at this price either. Then we have Davante Adams. I feel is a bit of a trap this year as he's stuck on an absolutely awful offense, and yeah, Gardner Minshew is fun, but he's honestly not that good, or else he wouldn't be on his third team in 4 years as a primary backup quarterback. Michael Pittman was the wide receiver 17 last year with Gardner Minshew, and DJ Chark was wide receiver 20 in Jacksonville with Gardner Minshew. Now, Adams is most definitely better than both of those guys, but he's also older, has some target competition with Jacoby Myers and now Brock Bowers. Plus, again, this team is just going to be so bad. I think you're going to be lucky if Adams returns on this ADP, let alone even beats it. I've talked about Chris Olave already on multiple videos on this channel about how he's been overvalued for fantasy football this year. He has never finished higher than wide receiver 20 so far in his career, and he's being drafted as a wide receiver 1 ahead of multiple guys who have been wide receiver 1s in fantasy already, if not even multiple times, with as good or even better chances of being a wide receiver 1 again in 2024 than Chris Olave. And the same goes for Drake London, who both have similar offensive coaching upgrades, but at least London got a quarterback upgrade that Chris Olave did not. I would actually rather take London here than Garrett Wilson at the 112, but I still don't like London compared to a bunch of receivers that you can get later. So all in all, I am not taking a receiver in the second round. There's just too much value at running back to make me pick a wide receiver here, especially if you already grabbed a wide receiver in round 1. All right, third round now. If you watch my video on 5 players not to draft this year, you'll find that 2 of them are in this round in James Cook and Rachaad White. If you want a more detailed argument for why I am not drafting either one, I'll link that video up in here so you can go check that out. But the TLDR on them is that you're expecting the same production that they had last year by drafting them as top 14 running backs. And Cook didn't even finish as a top 14 running back last year. So this is, again, anticipating a sort of breakout season for him that he hasn't done before. They both have new competition from the 2024 rookie class. They both are in worse offenses than they were in last year. And I think there are better bets for volume and touchdowns at the position later than you can get with both of these guys. So I am out on both James Cook and Rachaad White here. I do also want to mention that I will never, ever draft a quarterback this high, as we have 2 quarterbacks going in the 3rd round in this ADP. And I didn't even mention Josh Allen's 2nd round ADP, which is absolutely wild to me. The late round quarterback strategy has become way more mainstream, but it still has to be said that reaching on Allen, Mahomes, or Hurts this high is just setting your money on fire, and your league mates appreciate your donation to their championship. Into the 4th round, we have another player on my do not draft list, and that's Texans wide receiver Stephon Diggs. I just cannot get on board with Diggs at this price point around so many other receivers that I'd like way better for the 2024 season. He's getting old. He looked terrible to end the year last year, and I'm not even convinced that he's the 2nd best receiver on the team. I think he's the 3rd target by the end of the year, and I just do not want to rely on him as my fantasy wide receiver 2. I think the upside of him being a wide receiver 1 is completely gone, and even if you believe that he's the wide receiver 2 or even 1B on the Texans, there are still better team wide receiver 2s to draft in this range. Jalen Waddle, DK Metcalf, Devonta Smith. DJ Moore is also in a crowded room, but I like him a lot more than I do Stephon Diggs. And that's not even to mention that you can get Malik Neighbors later, George Pickens later, T. Higgins later, Terry McLaurin, Rashee Rice, even Tank Dell, who I believe outscores Stephon Diggs on his own team, you can get around later. And those are just the wide receivers. You can also get Joe Mixon, Kenneth Walker, Alvin Kamara, all in the 4th round too, that I prefer even as my RB3 flex player over Diggs as my wide receiver 2. 5th round now, and we're still at the wide receiver position because I am not really in love with Zay Flowers. Contrary to everyone else we've talked about, I actually don't mind this ADP for Zay Flowers as the wide receiver 27. I think it's actually pretty solid compared to his wide receiver 30 finish last year as a rookie. My issue with Flowers, though, is that I don't see any upside with him. The Ravens and Lamar Jackson specifically are not conducive to creating overly prolific fantasy wide receivers. It works for Mark Andrews because he's a tight end and a red zone threat, so 850 plus yards, 7 plus touchdowns, that is fantastic for a tight end, but for a wide receiver, that's just kind of bleh. That's like wide receiver 3 numbers. So when we're looking at Zay Flowers, he's a PPR volume receiver who is not being fed overly elite or even consistent volume on a weekly basis. He had 7 games last year with 8 or more targets, which is fantastic, but then also 5 games with 5 or fewer targets. He failed to top 60 yards in half of his games played, and because he's not a huge red zone threat, he only caught 5 touchdowns, 4 of which actually came in games without Mark Andrews. So you can see who the real wide receiver 1 in Baltimore actually is. Honestly, one of my favorite fantasy football fun facts is that the Ravens have never had a fantasy wide receiver 1 in Lamar Jackson's lifetime. The best receiver finish that Lamar has even supported was Hollywood Brown back in 2021 as the wide receiver 22 overall and wide receiver 28 in fantasy points per game. And Hollywood posted 1,000 yards and 6 touchdowns last year, which honestly feels somewhat of a ceiling for Zay Flowers in this offense with a healthy Mark Andrews, Lamar Jackson always willing to run, and now the addition of Derrick Henry, who might honestly just run for 2,000 yards anyways and not really leave much for the receivers offensively. Again, I think Flowers is totally fine if you just want like a consistent 12 PPR points every single week, but if you want the shot on getting something more, then Zay Flowers is not a good pick in the 5th round. All right, 6th round now, and we get to the worst pick in all of fantasy football in 2024. Raiders running back Zamir White. Again, the worst pick in all of fantasy football this season. Do not draft Zamir White. This is a brand new coaching staff, brand new offensive system than what it was with the Raiders last year. This is not the same offensive coordinator that was calling plays when White did well for 4 games without Josh Jacobs. He's not a receiving threat. That is Amir Abdullah's role. And no one has seemed to mention the fact that 3 of the 4 defenses he faced last year were bottom 10 in fantasy points allowed to running backs. 2 of them were actually bottom 5. He did tear up the Kansas City Chiefs. I'll give him credit there, but that was also a cold, divisional, outdoor December game where the Raiders scored twice on defense and were up by 2+ scores for over half the game. So White was just running down the clock. He averaged just 15 fantasy points per game on 23 touches per game over that 4-game stretch, which is horribly inefficient from a point per touch standpoint. And I seriously would not be surprised if he was not the starter by the end of the year. And I think that he's this year's version of Dameon Pierce, who lost his job halfway through to Devin Singletary last year. And if you want more evidence to not draft Zamir White, take a look at this tweet from Nathan Janke at Pro Football Focus, who showed the best fantasy finishes for every non-rookie running back to play in the second half of the second preseason game since 2021. The best finish was Devonta Freeman as the RB31, and the other 4 all finished outside the top 50, just like Dameon Pierce did last year. I just do not get why he's being valued as a mid to back end RB2 in ADP, and there are so many other running backs around him that I would much rather have. Guys like Ramondre Stevenson, David Montgomery, Tony Pollard, Najee Harris, DeAndre Swift, James Conner, Brian Robinson even. Please do not draft Zamir White this year. Moving into the 7th round, there really isn't a pick in here that I am actively against. I think everyone makes a ton of sense at each of their price points, and it really just comes down to how you've been building your roster up to this point. But I will throw out some words of caution when it comes to drafting one of these wide receivers, and that is Packers wide receiver Jayden Reed. Again, I don't think that he's a bad pick here at wide receiver 36, which is actually 11 spots lower than where he finished last year as a rookie, but I want to at least point out his splits with and without Christian Watson last year. Last year, Reed played 9 games without Christian Watson and averaged just 11 fantasy points per game. That was from weeks 4 through 13 and included 7 games after the Packers bye week as well. But in 7 games without Christian Watson, Reed's production spiked to 16.5 points per game on the back of an additional 2 targets per game, which led to more receptions, yards, and touchdowns. Last year, Reed posted 6 games with 7+ targets. 5 of them came without Christian Watson. Reed also had 5 games with 60+ receiving yards, and 3 of those, including his highest 2 on the year, came without Christian Watson. And all 4 of Reed's worst games with under 25 yards came when Christian Watson was on the field. And this makes sense when you think about it holistically. This Packers receiving core is taking a money ball approach to replacing Davante Adams, and there are a ton of mouths to feed, all within a very small differential of overall individual talent. So when they're all on the field, they're all cannibalizing each other for targets and production, but remove one of them from the equation, and now everyone else is going to see a bump as now everyone gets a bigger piece of the pie. And that's exactly what happened last year for Jayden Reed with Christian Watson out. Again, I'm not saying that he is a bad pick. I believe that Jayden Reed is the most talented receiver on this team. I think that he can make a year 2 leap that a bunch of wide receivers make, but I also believe that Christian Watson could be healthy more this year than he has been in years past, and that could be bad for Jayden Reed. You can actually draft Christian Watson 2 rounds later than Jayden Reed too, so if you want a piece of the Packers receiving core, why draft the most expensive one when there are perhaps just as good of options in rounds later, like Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, or even Dontavian Wicks? All right, 8th round now, and the easy answer for me as the worst pick of this round is Austin Eckler, a player that I covered in a previous video on sleepers that I am not buying into this year, and I will link that video again up here if you want to watch that. But besides avoiding Austin Eckler here, I am also avoiding Nick Chubb, a player that we just got news is going to start the year on the PUP list, meaning that he's guaranteed to miss at least the first 4 weeks of the 2024 season. And this is not the news that I want to hear from a running back returning from injury, especially one that's going to be returning over a year after his injury. He got hurt in week 2 last year and now won't be back until at least week 5. That is devastating news for how his recovery has been going and how horrible the injury actually was. And we have seen countless examples of players returning from major knee injuries that just are not effective at all their first year back. Last year, Javonte Williams averaged just 11 PPR points per game as the RB33 and looked horrible and was completely inefficient despite seeing a ton of volume for most of the year. Saquon Barkley in 2021, coming off his ACL injury, averaged 10.6 PPR points per game as the RB37 and got hurt again midway through the year and looked terrible all season. Same thing happened to Dalvin Cook in 2018 after his ACL injury, who came back to start the year, then got hurt again, missed over a handful of games, and really didn't do anything until weeks 11 or 12. Then there's the most recent example of a running back starting the year on the PUP, as last year it was Jonathan Taylor, who missed the first 4 games, didn't play well his first 2 weeks back, played another few games, then got hurt again, missed 3 more, and then returned to the fantasy playoffs to put up 10 and 17 points in the fantasy semis and championship, finishing the year as the RB33 overall. And that's exactly where Chubb is going right now, RB33 overall in ADP. And JT honestly feels like the best case scenario for the potential volume that Nick Chubb could have coming back. Jerome Ford looked pretty solid last year and is going to be the starter again with Nick Chubb out. And don't forget that Deonta Foreman is there too, who has been snagging passes out of the backfield and getting goal line work in the preseason in a very similar role to what Kareem Hunt has had over the past few years. There's just no guarantee that Chubb is going to come back to the volume that he had prior to getting hurt, and even if he does, there's no guarantee he'll be any good with it for fantasy football. I just can't get on board with taking a player this high who you know you won't have for the first 4 weeks, taking up valuable bench space early in the year, and then waiting even more after that before you feel any confidence whatsoever in him actually giving you the production that you want in your starting lineup. Looking at the 9th round here, I'm just going to make this super simple. I mostly dislike everyone in this range. The receiver depth all feels the same, and it's very flat heading into the 10th and 11th rounds, so I don't really like drafting anyone here besides really just taking the shot on Christian Watson. I don't like drafting Brock Bowers or Dallas Goedert that much, especially as my personal draft strategy would have me drafting a tight end way before we got to this round, so I don't need a tight end too. Gus Edwards is fine, but he's just kind of really blessed. So honestly, this is a great place to take a quarterback if you haven't yet. Grab Jaden Daniels, Jared Goff, Caleb Williams, Tua, Trevor Lawrence, or just avoid drafting anyone else in this range. Or reach for guys like Brian Thomas Jr. or Jerome Ford from the 10th round. I just don't really like anyone here at all at the skill positions. And finally, looking at the 10th round, I'm just going to omit kickers and defenses here just because it would be too easy to say that those guys are bad picks, which they are this early. Don't take kickers and defenses this early, please. But looking at the rest of the players, I think the easy answer is Dalton Schultz here. Again, like I just said, my personal strategy is already having a tight end on my roster before I get to this point, so I'm not looking to draft a backup. There's just no need. But even if you don't have a tight end yet, I would not be drafting Dalton Schultz at this ADP because he really isn't all that different from any other tight end that you can get much later. With the addition of Stephon Diggs, Schultz's already limited target share now gets even smaller. He's not an uber athletic player, so he can't really rely on big plays to offset that lower volume. He's at best the 4th option on the team, so that puts him in the category of a touchdown-dependent tight end, which he hasn't really been great at either, with 10 touchdowns over the past 2 years combined. I would not be shocked if his final stat line is somewhere around 50 receptions, 500 yards, and a few touchdowns, which you know whose 2023 stat line that's equivalent to? Basically like 10 other tight ends. Jonnu Smith, Chig Okonkwo, Tyler Conklin, Hunter Henry, Cade Otton. All of these guys hovered around that exact stat line I just said last year. So why draft Dalton Schultz in the 10th when you can get Pat Freiermuth in the 11th, Luke Musgrave in the 14th, or anyone else in the 14th or 15th rounds of your drafts like Hunter Henry or Tyler Conklin, Ben Sinnott or Zach Ertz, Cole Kmet or Gerald Everett. These guys are all the exact same players as Dalton Schultz, but they are rounds cheaper, so it makes zero sense to draft Dalton Schultz this high. So those are the players that I believe are the worst picks in the first 10 rounds of fantasy football drafts. But if you want to see all the players that I am targeting in every single round, including some of my favorite late round targets, then you can check out this video right up here.